Frankincense oil was never rare because of what it is. It became rare because of what the system decided it should be. For centuries, frankincense didn't belong to beauty, wellness, or self-care. It wasn't extracted to perform, to glow, or to promise visible transformation. It existed inside slow systems that accepted scarcity, unpredictability, and limits. Resin was collected by hand from trees that could not be rushed, forced, or industrialized without consequences. No urgency. No scaling pressure. No expectation of consistency. And that is exactly why it worked within those systems. But modern markets don't tolerate slowness. They don't tolerate irregular supply, fragile ecosystems, or materials that refuse to behave the same way every time. When frankincense entered global demand, nothing about the resin changed overnight. What changed was the environment around it. Quietly, structurally, and without asking permission. This video is not about what frankincense oil does. It's about what had to be removed, reshaped, and controlled so this oil could exist everywhere, all the time, without interruption, because frankincense oil didn't become powerful by improving. It became scalable when the system learned how to manage its limits. Before frankincense oil was bottled, branded, or refined into cosmetic-grade liquid, it existed as a boundary material. Its value was never based on abundance. In fact, its relevance came from the opposite: limitation. Frankincense trees grow slowly in harsh environments and produce resin only under specific conditions. Harvesting could not be rushed without damaging the tree itself. This created a natural ceiling that early systems respected, not because they were ethical, but because they had no alternative. The resin belonged to ritual, medicine, and trade routes that accepted loss, delay, and inconsistency. Some seasons produced more, others produced almost nothing. And that variability was not treated as a defect. It was understood as the cost of dealing with something alive. There was no expectation that frankincense would be available everywhere. Scarcity wasn't a marketing tool. It was a fact, and because the system around it moved slowly, the ingredient didn't need to adapt. The material set the rules. Humans followed. That balance would not survive modern demand. Frankincense resin does not behave like industrial raw materials. It oxidizes. It varies in composition depending on soil, climate, and harvest technique. Even the same tree can produce resin with different properties across seasons. For ancient systems, this was accepted. For modern systems, it is intolerable. Markets don't ask whether an ingredient is fragile. They ask whether it can be standardized. And standardization demands predictability. This is where tension begins. Because once frankincense oil is expected to appear on shelves year-round, across continents, inside formulations that require consistency, its natural behavior becomes a liability. Variability is reframed as instability. Slowness becomes inefficiency. Scarcity becomes a supply problem. The ingredient hasn't failed. The expectations have changed, and when expectations change, systems don't adapt gently. They intervene. Scaling frankincense oil is not about producing more resin. It's about producing a version of the oil that behaves correctly inside industrial timelines. That means longer shelf life, controlled scent profiles, reduced reactivity, and compatibility with mass formulations. This is where the oil begins to shift. Processes are introduced to minimize variation. Fractions are isolated. Certain volatile elements become undesirable. Handling protocols tighten. The goal is not improvement in a biological sense, but compliance in a logistical one. And these interventions are rarely framed as losses. They are presented as refinement, purification, optimization, but optimization always optimizes for something. In this case, it optimizes for transport, storage, and predictability, not for ecological integrity or material complexity. The system doesn't ask, what does this oil want to be? It asks, what must this oil become so we can sell it everywhere? Most consumers imagine processing as a single moment, pressing, distilling, bottling. But the real transformation happens across dozens of invisible decisions, each one small enough to feel harmless, yet cumulative in effect. Temperature thresholds are adjusted. Filtration increases. Stabilizing protocols are introduced. Compounds that threaten oxidation or inconsistency are quietly discouraged. The oil becomes calmer, more obedient, less reactive, and this obedience is rewarded. It flows through supply chains smoothly. It survives warehouses. It behaves inside formulations. It no longer surprises anyone, but something else happens at the same time. Complexity diminishes, not dramatically, subtly, enough that the oil still looks the same, smells familiar, and performs predictably, but no longer carries the full signature of its origin. The system doesn't call this loss. It calls it control. Once the oil is stable, it needs a new story. Ritual language doesn't scale. Ancient context doesn't convert. Markets require simplicity. So the vocabulary shifts. Sacred becomes premium. Ritual becomes routine. Scarcity becomes exclusivity. Complexity becomes clean. The oil is no longer something you encounter with respect. It becomes something you apply, and the consumer is invited into a narrative where frankincense feels timeless, pure and unchanged, even though the system around it has been entirely rebuilt. This isn't deception. It's translation, but translation always leaves something behind. The modern mistake is not believing in frankincense oil. The mistake is believing the oil exists outside systems. Ingredients don't fail. Systems reshape them. When people argue whether an oil works, they are already too late. The meaningful decisions happened long before the bottle reached their hands. Understanding. This doesn't require rejecting products. It requires seeing beyond labels. Once you see the system, the ingredient stops being a miracle and starts being a negotiation. Frankincense oil was never about the resin. It was about how much complexity a system was willing to tolerate, and modern systems tolerate very little. What survives is not what is most powerful, but what is most manageable. That is the quiet rule shaping natural ingredients. Today. If this changed how you see natural luxury, stay with the series. The next ingredient will look different, but the system behind it will feel familiar. Subscribe to follow the next story. And if one moment in this video shifted your perspective, leave a comment with that line. Awareness is the only upgrade that doesn't expire.